Night falls over eastern Poland. Suddenly, radar screens light up. Russian drones cross the border. Air raid sirens echo through the dark. Polish jets scramble into the sky. And then one village is hit. Was it a navigational mistake or a calculated test aimed at NATO? Because if it was a test, Moscow was not just flying drones. It was probing the shield that protects all of the West. Just days ago, several Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace during the night. Air raid sirens echoed, Polish jets scrambled, and a small farming village was hit. Warsaw called it a serious violation of sovereignty, not a navigational error. And it happened in the middle of Zapad, 2025, Moscow's massive military drills that simulate war with NATO, while allied capitals quietly debate how far deterrence should go and how much risk they are willing to take. This time, the violation was on NATO soil, and that changes everything. Because if this was not an accident, it might have been something far more dangerous, a test. In this video, we will break down why this incident stands out, explore what Russia could have been measuring, and ask what it revealed about NATO's real readiness and internal cohesion. We will also examine what this means for the United States, because when NATO is tested, Washington is too. And to be clear, this is not alarmism. This is analysis. Understanding potential tests is how you prevent future crises. So if you want to understand whether Moscow just probed the shield that protects the West, stay with us and subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. It happened in the dark, fast, and silent. According to Poland's Ministry of Defense, several Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace during the night, flying in from the Ukrainian front and cutting across the border before Polish radars could even lock on. Polish F-16 scrambles, air defense units activated, and parts of a rural village were briefly evacuated. One of the drones hit a farm building, causing damage but no casualties. NATO officials confirmed that the response was coordinated through the Combined Air Operations Center in Germany, showing how quickly the alliance's chain of command can react when a member state is touched. But here is what stands out. Warsaw called it a serious violation of sovereignty and summoned the Russian ambassador, while Moscow denied any intent and claimed the drone simply drifted off course. And yet Polish authorities released no details about the drone's speed, altitude, or type, leaving a gap that fuels a different question. Because this didn't look like a glitch. The drones entered together on coordinated paths during the peak of Russia's Zapad war games. That timing is hard to ignore. Was this just a mistake of navigation or something far more deliberate, a quiet test of NATO's shield? How do you tell the difference between an accident and a test? At first glance, this incursion could look like just another mishap. Drones get blown off course in war all the time. But several details make this one different. According to Reuters, past border violations were usually single drones or missiles that drifted off individually. This time they came together, moving in parallel paths as if flown with intent. And they didn't come on a quiet night. They crossed during Russia's massive Zapad war games, when tens of thousands of troops and hypersonic missile drills were underway, a moment when NATO air defenses were already stretched thin. That timing matters. It also happened just as Western capitals debated sending new long-range weapons to Ukraine, and as London summoned the Russian ambassador over hostile actions. That raises the question of signaling. Was this Moscow's way to say, "We can touch you," without firing a shot? Warsaw called it a serious violation of sovereignty, but stopped short of triggering NATO's Article 4 consultations, a sign of political caution that Moscow surely noticed. And while the Kremlin denied intent, Russian state media framed the breach as proof that NATO's shield is full of holes. Put all that together and it stops looking like an accident. It starts to look like a probe. Because if it really was just a mistake, why send several drones at once, on coordinated paths, straight through NATO airspace, in the middle of a high-alert exercise window? And that leads to the real question. If it was a test, what exactly was Moscow trying to measure? The answer is not just about drones. It is about how fast, how united, and how willing NATO really is to defend its own skies. According to AP, Polish fighter jets were scrambled within minutes, but it took longer to actually locate and track the drones flying low across the border. That delay matters. It shows how hard it is to defend against small, low-flying threats, and how every extra minute gives Moscow more room to act. Reuters reported that NATO's Combined Air Operations Center in Germany was alerted and coordinated with Baltic allies, but only after the Polish military confirmed the intrusion. That sequence reveals something critical. The first reaction depends on the nation under attack, and only later does the alliance move as one. Moscow may have been watching that gap like a stopwatch. Then there are the rules. Warsaw did not authorize its pilots to fire, even though international law would have allowed it if the drones were seen as an imminent threat. That decision sent a message, not just to Moscow but to NATO itself. Poland preferred caution over escalation, and Russia may have noted that too. Timing also matters. The incursion came as Russian war games surged near Belarus, saturating regional radar and stretching air defenses. In that clutter, it becomes harder to spot what is real and what is just noise, which is exactly the kind of confusion Moscow could exploit in a future hybrid push. Beyond the military signals, there were political ones. While Baltic leaders called the breach a warning, several Western capitals downplayed it. That split is exactly the kind of crack the Kremlin looks for. Because for Moscow, this was never just about flight paths. It was about psychology. Would NATO react fast? Would it react together? And would it be willing to take risks to defend its credibility? If the Kremlin thinks it has answers to those questions now, the next question is even more dangerous. What conclusions did it draw, and where might it test NATO next? If this was a test, what verdict did the Kremlin reach? There are three possible readings, and each one carries its own danger. The first is that NATO's deterrence works, but it is slow. According to AP, Polish jets were airborne fast but needed several minutes to actually find the drones. For Moscow, that gap may look like an exploitable window, a few precious minutes where a strike could land before defenses fully react. The second reading is that NATO's deterrence holds strong in the north, where Baltic states stay on high alert, but is softer in the east and southeast. The BBC noted that Baltic leaders called this breach a serious warning, while some Western capitals urged caution and downplayed the risk. To the Kremlin, that split may signal uneven willpower. Push near Estonia, and everyone jumps. Push near Poland or Romania, and the alliance hesitates. The third reading is the most dangerous, that NATO is politically divided. Russian state media like RIA Novosti have already framed the incident as proof that the alliance will not risk escalation, feeding the narrative that Western unity is fragile. If Moscow believes that message, it might push harder with more drone incursions, more radar saturation, and more cyber probes to stretch NATO's defenses thin. The CSIS has warned that Europe's air defenses are already under strain from constant alerts, and Russia knows it. This is how small probes can become strategy. Normalize the tension, erode readiness, and wait for the one moment when a distracted alliance blinks. And here is the real danger. If the Kremlin now thinks NATO is slow, uneven, or divided, the next test will not be about drones. It will be bigger, bolder, and harder to ignore. So what did Moscow see when it looked at NATO's shield up close? The truth is that NATO's defenses are powerful, but they are not built for endless strain. According to CSIS, Europe's stockpiles of short-range air defense missiles would run out quickly in a sustained crisis. Every scramble burns fuel, parts, and crew hours, and Reuters has reported that Polish F-16s are already flying at an unsustainable tempo just to cover routine alerts. The alliance can intercept, but it cannot do it forever. There are also gaps. The IISS has noted that many eastern NATO states still have blind spots in their low-altitude radar coverage, the exact level where small drones and cruise missiles fly. This means some threats might be seen only when they are already overhead. And then there is the decision chain. NATO can deploy forces fast once the political green light is given, but that green light still requires consensus from all 32 members. A NATO report from 2023 admitted that activating the NATO response force can take more than 24 hours, That is lightning speed for diplomacy, but an eternity in a drone war measured in minutes. This is why the United States still carries much of the load. According to AP, American aircraft, tankers, and surveillance drones provide most of the long-range coverage that keeps Europe's eastern skies protected. But that creates its own risk. If Europe cannot hold the line alone, any serious crisis pulls Washington in, whether it wants to be or not. And if the US stretches too thin, other adversaries will notice. Here is the uncomfortable question. If the next wave is bigger, faster, and deadlier than a handful of drones does, NATO have the depth to absorb it, or would the shield crack before reinforcements arrive? For Washington, the Polish drone incident is more than a local scare. It forces the United States to rethink the balance between credibility and overextension. The U.S. has nearly 10,000 troops deployed across Poland and the Baltic states, and it leads the NATO Combined Air Operations Center in Germany, which coordinates Allied air defenses on the eastern flank. Every time Russian drones cross a NATO border, those systems quietly activate. Crews scramble, and American forces stand by. This readiness comes at a cost. Since 2022, the U.S. has surged over 20,000 additional troops into Europe, while also trying to deter China in the Indo-Pacific and contain tensions in the Middle East. The Pentagon's own analysts warn about overstretch, and think tanks like RAND and CSIS call it the two-war trap, the risk that America becomes too committed in Europe to respond effectively in Asia. Yet Washington cannot afford to look hesitant. Deterrence works only if Moscow believes the U.S. will act. If the U.S. response to incidents looks slow or uncertain, the Kremlin may test harder and others may follow. Beijing is watching. Tehran is watching. Even North Korea is watching. This is why a few drones over Poland can trigger war games at the Pentagon and emergency calls between Washington and Brussels. A misstep here could echo from Kiev to Taipei. But every show of force has a price. It raises the chance of accidents, cyber retaliation, and domestic backlash as American voters grow tired of endless deployments. So Washington is caught in a paradox. Act too softly and deterrence erodes. Act too strongly and it accelerates escalation. How long can the U.S. walk that line before it has to choose between protecting its credibility or protecting its limits? The danger is not just what Moscow plans. It is what could happen by mistake. In 2022, a single stray missile hit Poland and killed 2 civilians. NATO called an emergency meeting overnight, fearing the start of a wider war. It turned out to be an accident, but for hours the world held its breath. That is how thin the line is. This drone incident sits on the same edge. NATO's radar network is crowded, pilots fly armed patrols on tight schedules, and political leaders are under constant pressure to show resolve. All it would take is one misread radar blip, one civilian plane mistaken for a drone, one air defense crew pulling the trigger too fast. Moscow could deny it. Washington could hesitate. And suddenly, the headlines would say Article 5. According to RAND, this is how major wars between nuclear powers often start, not with a plan, but with a miscalculation. And the scariest part is that no one can say where the red line really is. NATO will not declare it. Russia will not admit it. Yet everyone knows it exists, and everyone is inching closer. So here is the real question. What happens the day one of these tests crosses it by accident? There is a wide space between silence and war. NATO does not have to fire a shot to send a message. It can tighten the shield. More air defense systems along the eastern flank, especially in Poland and the Baltics, where low-altitude drones can slip past radar. It can update the rules of engagement, giving local commanders more authority to intercept unidentified aircraft faster. It can increase joint patrols over border regions and publicly release reaction times, showing Moscow that future tests will get instant answers. It can hit Russia in the shadows, not with missiles, but with cyber defenses and targeted tech sanctions, blocking the flow of components that Moscow's drone industry depends on. These are not dramatic moves, but they work. They raise the cost of testing NATO without triggering war. And they show something more important: unity. Because what deters the Kremlin is not just weapons, it is the sight of allies acting as one. The challenge is that unity is harder to show than firepower. If Washington pushes too hard, it risks looking like escalation. If it holds back, it risks looking divided. So here is the real gamble. Can the alliance act visibly enough to deter Moscow without giving it the confrontation it wants? What does the Kremlin really want from a night like this? Not a war with NATO, not yet. It wants proof. Proof that the alliance is slower than it looks, more divided than it says, easier to rattle than it admits. A drone crossing a border is cheap. A split headline in Western capitals is priceless. Moscow understands the arithmetic of pressure. Big offensives drain money, men, and political oxygen. Small probes create noise at low cost, and each one teaches a lesson. If NATO hesitates, that lesson is simple. Push again. If NATO responds but argues first, push smarter. If NATO reacts fast and together, pause, wait, and look for another seam. The message is shaped for two audiences. Outward for us, it says, Russia can touch the West when it chooses. Inward, for the Russian public, it says the West is scared and confused. That is why the Kremlin denies intent, even as state media celebrate the breach. It keeps options open. It plays on doubt. It preserves the ability to say, we did nothing, you overreacted. And timing is part of the game. Tests like this often arrive when Western politics are distracted elections, budget fights, leadership changes. The goal is not just to measure radars, it is to measure attention spans. If Washington is busy, if Europe is split, then the same probe buys more leverage. There is also a wider map behind Poland. Beijing and Tehran read the same signals. If the United States looks stretched, Russia's small wins echo in the Pacific and the Gulf. That is the strategic return the Kremlin wants, not just a headline but a chain reaction of caution across the West. So what stops Moscow from pushing further? Clear costs, delivered quickly, without giving it the crisis it craves. Unity it cannot spin away. Speed it cannot ignore. Discipline it cannot exploit. The Kremlin is not afraid of strength. It is afraid of certainty. When the alliance acts with certainty, small tests lose their value. When it hesitates, small tests become a strategy. If you were sitting in the Kremlin tonight and you had watched how this incident unfolded, would you press harder next week, or would you wait for a better moment? If this was a test, it was never really about drones. It was about psychology. About showing the West that Russia can cross a NATO border and still walk away. About watching how long it takes our systems to react, how much our leaders argue, how far our unity bends before it breaks. This is how modern power works. Not with declarations, but with tiny cracks opened again and again until one of them becomes a fault line. That is why this matters for Washington. Because every hesitation, every gap, every mixed signal today is a message not just to Moscow, but to every rival watching from afar. America's challenge is not only to defend the map, it is to defend the idea that its alliances still move fast, stand firm, and act together. If the Kremlin walks away thinking otherwise, the next test will be bigger, riskier, and harder to stop. The question is no longer if these tests will continue. The question is how many it will take before one becomes the spark that lights something no one can control. So what do you think Washington should do next? Show strength now and risk escalation, or play the long game and answer quietly but decisively? Tell us in the comments. And if this video gave you a new way to see what just happened on NATO's eastern edge, hit like and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next.